I don't know if you guys know much about how these echoes work, but before an echo session, the team gets together and looks at possible topics, as well as also looking at, you can go to the next slide, as well as also looking at, suggestions that people have brought in. And so Lisa and I, when we were going through all of the different subjects, Lisa and I both raised our hand and said we'd volunteer to kind of take the lead on this kind of at times challenging conversations. And so before we get into the actual presentation, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why we chose this one. So Lisa, why did you volunteer to be part of this particular presentation?
Oh, wow. Okay. It's not because it's in my comfort zone, not because I love to walk around and talk about sex all the time, but I feel like it's an important thing and it's not discussed healthy enough. And then Oni and I talked a little bit about a shared experience we had when we were both like CNAs and I'll let Oni talk about his, but I was this little CNA in a veterans home with a whole bunch of men, and I never knew how to handle some of that stuff that came at me. And there was plenty of sexual behavior, and I was not trained and I was not supported and I didn't understand. And so we want to talk more to this population about how we can have those conversations.
Yeah, Lisa, I wasn't actually necessarily going to talk about my one thing that we share, but I will. You can go to the next slide, Lindsay. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is I actually think we could, I could do a lot better. And we as an industry, as healthcare providers could be doing better. We had a situation a couple years ago with a veteran who had Parkinson's disease and was not married and wasn't necessarily at this building, but was unable to masturbate. And somebody who throughout their life had been able to do that, but physically couldn't do it anymore. And when I attempted to initiate those conversations with the staff, I really didn't quite get the response that I was looking forward to. And so kind of had to recalibrate. And, one of the wonderful things about these echoes is that we do get a chance to talk. I mean, there's 42 people on the chat right now. So really quite good outreach to the whole state. And to talk about how we could possibly do things better. And one of the things I do want to talk about is how we could listen a little better. But the story that Lisa alluded to is when I was a CNA, I was actually a resident advocate back in the late 90s. I was working in a group home. And one of my very first days in the group home, I was taking care of a woman with profound schizophrenia, but she did have a sex life. And the manager showed me to her room and let me know that it was my job to make sure that her self-stimulation toys were hygienic and were clean, because that was important. It was important for her, but it was also important for her not to be getting, recurring infections. And so I'm 22 years old, and that was kind of a, right out of the gates type experience. Before we get into the whole presentation, go ahead and turn the next slide over. I want to do a little exercise. And so this was something that some interns did a few years ago when they were working at the veterans home. And similar to Lisa, they had this experience that people just aren't really talking about these things. And people might be left without getting, a 360-degree attention to their lives. And so they did this exercise, and I'm going to do it with you guys. And so what I want you to do really quickly is on your table or wherever you're at, just find a paper clip, piece of paper or Post-it, and a pen or a pencil. And then I want you to arrange them on your desk in the order of what is most valuable, but I'll let you decide if it's monetary value, emotional value, historical value. So I want you to arrange those. And then in the chat, real quick, just drop in, whoever is comfortable doing that, just drop in 1, 2, 3, how you arrange those 3 objects. So go ahead and, so awesome. Who else arranged them? Awesome. So if you guys are looking at the chat, you'll see that not everybody had the pen as the first one. That's interesting. Uh, there's quite a variation. A lot of people went with pen most valuable, but we've got other things being most valuable, paper. And what I wanted to just briefly talk about is we've got 42 professionals, smart people on the call. And when I asked you to do a very simple thing of organizing these, we all came up with different ways of organizing them. And that's because value is a social construct. Value is determined by the society that you live in, by your experiences, by your current place in life. If you're in a room full of paper and you only have one pencil, then you're going to maybe put the pencil as more important. So much like this little exercise that we did as a, just to briefly explore the idea of social constructs, sexuality is absolutely a social construct. This is not something that any of us get to decide for somebody else. This is something that is very personal. And much like I often say that if you know somebody with Alzheimer's, then you know somebody with Alzheimer's. You do not know everybody with Alzheimer's. And if you know sexual function, sexual history in somebody with dementia, then you know it for that one person. And so we'll talk about it a little bit more when in a few minutes, but just really want to hold this idea that there is no set definition of sexuality, and it is really variable to individuals. Awesome. Lisa, you want to, we'll go to the next slide and, oh, well, yeah, that was discussion. Thank you. Yes, as discussed. It takes in all these different things, as well as where you are in life. Excellent. You can go to the next slide.
All right. Yeah, go to the next slide, please. There we go. So we're looking at, like, what is sex, right? And we all have a different idea of what that means to us in our experiences. But at its core, we're looking at these things that it promotes. So safety, body image can include all of those types of things. I love this last point. It is essential to approach the topic with humility, inclusivity, and an openness to diverse expressions of identity and intimacy. So we are not allowed to put our own values on top of somebody else's and supersede. So go ahead with the next slide, please. All right. So as an occupational therapist, we have several areas of occupation, and a big area for us is that ADL, activities of daily living. So our OT practice framework, our foundational document that defines what we do and how we do it, identifies sexual activity as a basic ADL. So basic activity of daily living. And the practice framework defines it as engaging in the broad possibilities for sexual expression and experiences with self or others. So it's pretty wide there. That can really include a lot of different things. I love that it can include cognitive intimacy, physical intimacy, commitment, and mutuality. So it usually involves another person, not always, but it does involve, it's not just the sexual act itself. And here's another really important one. A diagnosis of dementia, or even being geriatric, does not imply the cessation of sexuality. I know that we don't see that portrayed in the media. We don't see that really talked about in the literature a ton. But just because we're old, just because we have dementia, does not mean we don't have a sex drive. Go ahead with the next slide, please. In dementia care, we know that the relationship changes. As a person becomes more dependent, needs more help, their relationships change, roles change. My grandmother went from somebody who was vibrant and took care of everybody to the one needing help, and people didn't quite know how to do that role reversal. But role changes also change intimacy. When you are having to take care of somebody, it is hard to also feel that intimacy and that vulnerability, that thing that you need. So the role changes can be different between caregiver and partner. And it impacts both the person with dementia as well as their partner. And we have to look at different ways to maintain intimacy. So it may not be their sexual relationship may not include actual intercourse. We may just be looking at different ways to define that sexuality. Are there ways to express themselves in a healthy way that is comfortable for both parties? Go ahead with the next slide, please. So in the literature that I was looking at, what we found was that the non-sexual forms of intimacy remain important. So things like kissing, cuddling, hand holding, massage, those types of things are important. They're a little easier to access, maybe a little more socially acceptable. I don't know. But other changes were including there was a big loss of interest because I got to tell you, if you're a 24-hour caregiver and you are exhausted, sex is probably not first on your mind at the end of the day. So there is some loss of interest, and things can become awkward, as you can imagine. And because of the nature of dementia, and we have that loss of filter, inhibition, there can be some awkward, some requests outside a normal relationship, things we might term as a behavior. And so that's another thing that can change. But in this article that I looked at, they said that sexuality is a fundamental right of older adults, even in the presence of dementia. Diagnosis of dementia does not imply cessation of sexual life or loss of capacity to consent. So we're finding that consent can go well into the moderate stages of dementia. And Oni's going to talk a little bit more about that kind of thing a little bit later, but and that does become an issue. Consent does become an issue. But just because you have dementia does not mean you can't consent. Go ahead with the next slide, please. And I think, Oni, these are yours.
Wonderful. Before we kind of launch into a deeper dive, kind of want to just look at some of the literature on hypersexuality versus, healthy sexuality, because for those of us that are in the field, it can seem like all we hear about is the problems. And it can seem like this is 100% of everybody. And I was a little bit validated in seeing that it's less than 10%, according to this study, of people with dementia that have hypersexuality. However, the factors that are associated with being hypersexual, as somebody who's now been at the Veterans Home for 20 plus years, and this is basically every day with me, our male gender, which we're 94% men in the building, as opposed to a lot of other nursing home, alcohol use and tobacco use. And so if it feels like every day I come to work and most of the people I work with that have a pretty profound dementia process, that's because we're skewed a little that direction. But it is definitely not everybody. And so, I am personally more interested for the purposes of this particular conversation in like what Lisa was talking about in terms of promoting healthy sexuality in people who are in relationships with caregivers or are not in relationships, but are not being hypersexual. They're just trying to figure out how to maintain their humanity with cognitive impairment and with less ability to maybe have privacy because now they have caregivers coming in or doctors that they have to talk to. So just using this study as a way to couch the overall conversation. Go ahead to the next slide. The conversation of consent is super duper interesting. And I've, again, keeping in the nursing home where we are regulated, people with dementia, which is a broad diagnosis, but we'll say moderate to advanced, can only consent to sexual intercourse with their already married partner. That's something I've been taught by various attorneys over the years and talked with health and welfare. And so, unfortunately, people with dementia who are no longer married in a nursing home, because we care plan and we have a responsibility, and we're federally and state regulated, we cannot. There is no way to develop a care plan for somebody to have sexual intercourse with a well-diagnosed dementia, unless it is somebody they're already married to, and that has to do entirely because of this concept of person and environment, which is central to social work. That the person and the environment are an ever-changing unit, and the environment for people with dementia, when they're going in and out of realities, they can be 70 years old at one moment, then 50 years old. they could be at their hometown in Gooding, and then they can be back in Boise. And because of that fluctuating cognition, what I've been taught by attorneys, even though 20 years ago I was developing care plans for safety and stuff, is that since somebody's cognition can change, because that's something that happens with dementia, that you can't really put together a care plan for sexual intercourse. Now, building off of what Lisa said, I can develop all sorts of care plans for intimacy. But just, that's a question I get all the time. But I'm again, I'm trying not to focus this particular piece on what's going on in the nursing home, although if people do have questions, we can talk about that as well. But looking at the person within their environment, was their environment apartment and now there are caregivers coming in? Are they living with their daughter or with their son when they weren't previously? So now privacy, intimacy, coordinating, all those things change depending on the environment that you're in. And then of course the person can change too. Go on to the next slide, please, Lindsay. So, challenges. One of the biggest challenges is, again, that environment that you take, you're out with your husband, you're out with your dad, you're out with your wife, and they feel an urge to touch themselves, or they're not, maybe they had a pattern of having sex with their partner or masturbating, every couple days, every couple weeks, and they've not been able to do that. And so they have a biological feeling of needing to be satisfied, but now they're in Applebee's. And how do you handle that? And that gets people to the doctors. And the idea that they might be hypersexual is at least worth exploring. But like we saw from the data, it's only 10% of the people who are hypersexual. So what we're really dealing with is misinterpreting signals, is not being aware of your surroundings, and not having that filter that all of us have to prevent us from doing socially inappropriate, unacceptable things in social situations. The classic "don't yell fire" in the movie theater situation. Ideally, most people are not touching themselves in public. That would be criminal. I mean, that would literally be criminal in the absence of a diagnosis. And so what do you do about that? And I'm just going to identify some of the misinterpretation. You're a caregiver, you're in the home, husband and wife are still together. You go into the bath and you start to give the husband a bath, and the husband says, "Come hither, why don't you get in the bath with me?" Now the caregiver has to explain to the wife or the paid caregiver has to explain to the wife or the daughter that this happened. It's tremendously embarrassing. And again, the default would be to say the person's being hypersexual, when there's a very, very good chance that they're just not in the same world reality and they're misinterpreting signals. And then, the worst, not the worst, but one of the hardest ones comes to me when people make passes at their children, or in really unfortunate situations at other family members. And then there's, so these are all of the possible problems. I imagine this is not a comprehensive list of possible challenges with dementia and healthy sexuality, but all of these deal with that idea of misinterpreting the world around you and picking up on signals, but they're not the signals. So if you want to go to the next slide, as we get into interventions, so much of the intervention involves helping people understand what the person with dementia is going through, and helping them understand that it is actually possible to, at one moment, know you're in your house, step into the bathroom, and now be somewhere else. And that is, there's not really it's hard for all of us to wrap our heads around. And so as professionals, whatever we can do, whether it's videos, whether it's articles, whether it's books, to somehow give some insight into what the world might look like when it's changing, when it's not reliable, and when you're not even aware of the change. And so just did a little research on, how to ask good questions and how to not freak out when people tell you the honest truth. And so, I think all of us would agree that before we design an intervention, we want to get a good assessment. Well, good assessments when you're hearing stuff that might make your eyes bug out a little bit. It involves that kind of rational detachment, that you're putting yourself in a position, you want to talk about this, but you really don't want to show any facial reactions. You can turn people away from openness really, really quickly because it's already uncomfortable. If they're actually talking about it, there's a decent chance that they're just as uncomfortable as we are. And any sort of whoa, or really, any of that could just stop the whole conversation. And like I said at the beginning, since sexuality is a social construct, people never having sex with their wives, people having sex every day, those are both totally normal things along the continuum. And so we want to hear about that. And so how do we do that rational detachment? We prepare ourselves. So as far as once we've done a good assessment, and it's really important that we do a good assessment, we want to identify where are the risks, because we said healthy sexuality. We're not just talking about, free for all. We're in a role of trying to promote health. And unfortunately, one of the hardest things is people get discharged all the time from independent living, from assisted living, and from skilled nursing, as well as from their own house where they're living with their daughter, but they made a pass at their daughter and now, or son-in-law, or fill in the blank. And now that's no longer a safe situation. And so housing/eviction, I think, are very high up on the top of the list. Personal safety, hygiene, also become very important. I've worked with people in the past who, at least 3 different people in the past who have some masochistic behavior when it comes to their sexual gratification. Sounding is the term, where you're inserting something into your penis. And I've had 3 different veterans over the years that I've worked with who do that. And when you're out of your house and you don't have your little drawer or your little, pouch of safe devices, you might use a drinking straw or a metal tube, which could lead to horrible infections as well as damage. And so if there's a decent chance that, when somebody moves in, your family's never heard that this is something you do. There's maybe a chance that even if your wife, if she was still alive, wouldn't have known that this was something you do. And now a CNA or a social worker walks in, the person's ashamed. It's hard to have that rational detachment. But let's just say we do a good job. And so we're going to put together a safety plan to make sure that those acts are done, safely and hygienically. And then, of course, there's the safety to others. I think we can't ignore the fact that there is, in those cases of hypersexuality, and also just both with men and women, there's the potential for safety issues. And communication, making people aware. Again, I wanted to have this whole conversation be about openness, because that's the only way that we can really intervene. And it's not, it's not always a comfortable topic to have. Go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so we've done a great assessment. The person trusts us. We're now working on some interventions for both safety and to reduce harm. That is where it's a great idea to have that approach as an ADL, that, well-being. Okay, now we're going to reduce harm, but wait a second, this is something that actually makes people feel good, ideally. And so we're going to look at this as part of their overall well-being. And when we have care conferences, when we meet with the doctor, it is going to be a piece of what we talk about, because we recognize that it can improve well-being. We're going to try and be open with the MD and the care team, whether that's a housekeeper that comes in once a week and we need to work on privacy. You know, we're going to say, hey, just so you know, sometimes my wife and I are intimate. I know she's got some pretty profound cognitive impairment. But when you come over, if we're in the room, just give us our privacy. I'm not going to fill in every possible permutation, but just openness and communication with whoever might be part of the care team, even though it's awkward. And sometimes that involves talking with the kids as well. I know no parents want to talk with their kids about their sex lives, but if mom or dad passes away and now the kids are in the position of primary caregiver, primary go-to, it can be super helpful for them to be aware of some of these conversations that maybe have taken place. So, you know, again, engaging the experts, being open-minded, and then communication. You can go ahead to the next slide.
And Oni, I just want to jump into that. Oftentimes in a, like a skilled nursing or a home health situation, OT is employed to do, like bathing and dressing and things like that. But healthy sexuality is very appropriate as part of the care plan. So considering widening that team a little bit, it doesn't have to just be the caregiver trying to figure this out on their own. They're on their own.
That's awesome. And I really, in preparation for this with you last week and talking, and that idea is an ADL. I mean, if somebody wasn't eating very well and their nutrition was at risk and it could affect their overall well-being, of course we could talk to a nutritionist. But we're also looking at what's going on around the house, the environment. Is it too noisy? Can the person physically do these things? So having a slightly detached approach and just looking at as professionals that trying to improve well-being, bringing in as many professionals as possible. I didn't want to end without at least exploring something that I've done quite a bit of here, which is, therapeutic touch. And so a couple years ago, we actually had a massage therapist come in and taught everybody on hand massage. You put some gloves on, you get some lotion, you massage the hands. It's not rocket science, but it does reduce agitation. And there's some statistics in nursing homes that people literally, and I'll extrapolate to in the home setting as well. When you're getting cared for, you're not getting touched outside of being cared for. And it is okay to have a hand on the back, a therapeutic use of touch. And so we want to consider how people with dementia, how often they experience touch. Like literally just being physically touched, not in a sexual way, but the majority of it is cares. And as human beings, I think we need to be touched, hugged, a gentle hand on the shoulder. And folks in a nursing home or others might go weeks or months or years, depending on the situation, without any healthy touch. And so kind of expanding the concept of sexuality to intimacy, to even just touch. I didn't feel like if we had you guys here for a few minutes, I'd do my due diligence without at least touching on that a little bit. No pun intended. Next slide. So just some tips. We don't want to, if somebody's never got a foot massage, we don't suddenly want to start with a foot massage, or maybe ever with a foot massage. But we want to have it be familiar and respectful touch. We, of course, want to observe people's preferences. And so there's huge cultural variations. And letting people know that we're there for them with calm voice and good eye contact. And during personal care, to have intentional touch. A lot of times what I get is somebody grabbed me while I was bathing them. But if you're not talking about what you're doing and communicating at every step, and then also maybe having a hand on the back, so that there is touch, but you're controlling the intention of it to keep it safe and healthy. Those are just all, potentially good things. And I know most of us on this call are not direct caregivers, but the idea would be to use this information to explore with husbands or wives or nursing home people or assisted living. Okay, here's the issue. Could you describe what toileting looks like? Could you describe what a bath looks like? And maybe try and weave in some of this knowledge or, potential opportunities. I think next slide. I think that's it. Awesome. Before we roll right into the case study, And these PowerPoints are always available on the Echo. Before we roll into the case study, was there any questions for Lisa and I on the presentation? You can throw it in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask any questions. Thank you, guys.
Really, we want to just come away with the idea that it's okay to use this as part of the assessment, part of the visit with the doctor, with another care provider, that caregivers can feel open and the people with dementia can feel open and trusting to us as care providers.
Okay, we have one question.
Yeah.
So I have a caregiver is concerned about their loved one being reported to CPS or APS.
Mhm.
I guess I don't know enough to answer that one. Do you want to unmute and ask the question? Marcy?
Sure. I just have had caregivers. I work in the caregiver support program at the Boise VA. So when there are caregivers whose loved one with a condition will be sexually inappropriate with comments to a grandchild, or then the caregiver gets concerned, and then they're keeping their loved one away from all family gatherings because they're not quite sure how to handle it. So it gets tricky.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
at least I don't know if you have a response, but this is something I've worked with in the nursing home. And I actually, I hate to say it, but you probably need to have adults present. That is concern,
Mhm.
when there's grandchildren involved. But again, it kind of comes down to communication ahead of time, just so you know, grandpa doesn't always know where he's at and might say things that might catch you off guard. But when it comes to little ones, I don't think I can prepare them without necessarily. I probably wouldn't have them be around grandpa without an adult like to be present. Yeah, Lisa, do you have a?
No, just to go with that talking ahead of time, to the family that, grandpa's different than he used to be. He doesn't always think through things, having people knowing ahead of time. And understanding in like different stages, like Oni kind of talked about before, we can be in different cognitive states. And if your daughter looks an awful lot like her mother, that you flirted with and had a relationship with. I mean, in their mind, that's a very natural thing. So it's kind of trying to put yourself in that place, but we definitely have to be wary too of especially grandchildren. You don't want to freak them out or put them in a terrible situation. So
Yeah, and I think we're having this conversation. It's I haven't found too many family members who are open like we are with regards to this. Because once again, I think one of the slides said it's one thing if we're the professional versus being the actual family member. So thank you.
So I think we'll move on to the case study. There was a question about whether or not the limiting sexual consent in nursing homes is state statutes versus liability. And my impression is it's mainly liability. You would need to have a 100% guarantee that somebody with the moderate to advanced dementia would never fluctuate in their cognition, and you can't necessarily promise that. So